Today we talk about donor eggs, what they are, and how they can help you build your family.
I'm Dr. Mark Amols, and this is Taco Bout Fertility Tuesday.
In fertility, there are times when people cannot use their own eggs or sperm to be able to have a child. And in those situations, we need to use donors to be able to build our family. In these next few episodes, we're going to be talking about things like donor sperm, donor eggs, and even surrogacy. But today we're going to focus on donor eggs. So what does it mean when someone says they have to use donor eggs? It means that they're going to be using another person's eggs and then putting either with their partner's sperm or some sperm supply. And usually this can be for several reasons. One of those reasons could be is that the person has such severe egg quality that they cannot get pregnant with their own eggs. So this would be someone, let's say, who is like 45 or older. Not that they can't get pregnant, but the chances are very low and they want their best chances. Now, there are other reasons too people would use donor eggs. For example, some people have had surgeries where they lost their ovaries, and so they need to use donor eggs, or have even undergone chemotherapy and lost the ability to reproduce with their own eggs. There are even other situations such as diseases, that someone may have a very severe disease that runs in their family. And because of this severe disease, they don't want to have children with their own eggs, so they would rather use a donor egg to prevent any further family members from having that disease. Even same-sex couples who are males cannot have kids on their own because they don't have eggs. So they need a donor to donate the egg so they can then put it with their sperm to be able to have children of their own. Now, in the end, no one really wants to use donor eggs. Even someone who needs to use them doesn't want to use them. They would love to just be able to procreate on their own, even if they could just take a cell from their body and make a baby. But for some people, using donor eggs is even much more difficult because sometimes it's a decision you absolutely don't want to do. For example, in the situation where someone does have poor egg quality and cannot get pregnant with their own eggs, or in the situation where their eggs have become poor quality because of chemotherapy or other treatments. And making that decision is not an easy decision. It should really be your last resort decision because the interesting thing about donor eggs is that they always work. Meaning, if you were 33 and you were considering using donor eggs because let's say you have very severe egg quality, the important part to realize is that it doesn't matter if you do it then or if you do it 5 years from now. The chances are the same because the donor eggs will still be younger. Your uterus will still be fine. And so what's important about donor eggs to understand is that if you're considering them, keep in mind it should be your last resort. No matter what, it's emotional. I don't care if you're using it because you're two men or if you're using it because you don't have good eggs. Having to pick the person that's going to represent who you feel will be best for your kids is always going to be emotional. If you were a woman who is picking a donor, a lot of times women will pick donors who feel like they represent them best, whether it's by height, athleticism, if it's the color of their skin, they pick someone they feel represents them best. If men are doing it, they're picking someone who they feel has attributes that they want their kids to have. This journey is so emotional that it's recommended by the American Society of Reproductive Medicine to have everyone who uses donor eggs to undergo a psych evaluation, both the donor and the recipient. I've once mentioned this before, but one kind of personal story for myself is that I grew up in a family where my dad would tell me that he wouldn't love a kid who was adopted versus having our own blood. Blood was very important to him. And so I've always had this kind of view of like, wow, using donor eggs, if my wife and I had to use that would be tough because my dad may not love them as much. And so I had this kind of skewed view of it. And we considered using donor eggs because we didn't know we would ever be pregnant again. And the first time when this came up, when we didn't know we'd ever get pregnant the first time, it was something I kind of was completely against. Not to the point that I wouldn't do it, but just I really didn't want to do it because I felt like, it's not my wife's eggs, it's not her DNA. Just like I would be concerned about using donor sperm. And I've talked about this before in other podcasts where when I had my kids, my whole view changed. Because I started realizing that my kids were me, not because of my DNA, but because of the way we raised them. When people would say, oh, they're just like you, they weren't just like me because they had a certain feature I have. It was because of the mannerisms, the way that I taught them. And that's when I realized that the DNA just has a little part of it. In reality, what molds our kids is us and how we want them to be and how we raise them. Matter of fact, quite interesting, there's a thing called epigenetics, which has to do with the DNA you're born with is kind of the blueprint of how things are supposed to be. But life can actually adjust that blueprint a little bit. It can't change it, but it can turn on and off certain DNA that can then affect the results of the DNA. So one of the common questions I get is, well, if I use a donor, and it grows in me, will it have any of my DNA? And I tell them no. But the quality of the environment that the baby's in, such as if there's a high glucose environment or if there's a low glucose environment, might change the DNA of that baby. So if the baby had a risk for, let's say, diabetes in their life, by having a better environment in utero, it may lower that risk because of epigenetics. It would turn off certain genes that maybe were going to be on if it was in the original mother. And so, although the DNA may not change from the codons, you can affect through epigenetics how that DNA is turned on and off. So it's kind of nice to know that you are imprinting your DNA in some ways onto them by affecting the epigenetics. So let's talk a little bit about what the process is. To understand donor eggs, you have to first understand that there are more than one type of donor eggs. When it comes to donors, there is what are called anonymous donors and known donors. Anonymous donors are people who you don't know and you will never meet that go through the cycle and give you their eggs. A known donor is someone you know who may be in your life, or at least you know of, that would donate their eggs. Known donors are usually going to be family members, a sister, a cousin, or potentially even a friend. Whereas anonymous donors are usually from agencies that have found women who would be good donors, and then you pay them to have that person go through. Later, we'll discuss how that affects things financially. Then you take anonymous donors, and those get broken down into what are called fresh donors and frozen donors. Now, known donors are always fresh because you know them, they're going through for you, and you get all their eggs when they go through the process. But anonymous donors can be fresh or they can be frozen, meaning when we talk about frozen donors, we're saying the donor has already gone through the process. All of their eggs were taken out, meaning the eggs they made that month, and then were frozen, and then you were buying an aliquot of those eggs, so let's say 6 or 8 eggs, and then putting that with the sperm to make embryos. Versus in the fresh donor, they go through the IVF process, and every egg they get is put with the sperm. Now, as you can imagine, the nice thing about anonymous donor is you're never going to see them again. So if you feel comfortable in telling people that the baby came from you and you don't want anyone to ever know you as a donor, it's much easier to say versus if it's a known donor and the other person's in your life. Now, it's important to understand anonymous is kind of thrown out the door these days because with things like 23andMe, donors and the kids can eventually find themselves because of these tests. And so we never say it's truly anonymous, but from general purpose it is. fresh donors are going to be a little bit more complicated than frozen. And that's because there's a lot more that has to go on. With a fresh donor, you have to first find the donor, just like you would a frozen. But then that donor, because they're going through the cycle for you, has to be synchronized with the clinic, with their schedule, with your schedule. And so with a fresh donor, it could sometimes take months. Maybe another person has already asked them to be the donor for them. You have to wait till they're done until you can do it. So one of the biggest differences between a fresh donor and frozen donors is just the time commitment. Even if you're using a known donor, you still have to get everything lined up with their schedule, the clinic schedule, and even for you to be able to do a transfer. Now, with frozen donors, because they've already been through, there are these large banks that have frozen donors, and you just go through a catalog, you find the donor you feel most comfortable with, and then once you find that donor, they can just thaw it, put it with a sperm, and you will be putting an embryo back to you in a short amount of time. So in general, what I tell people is, with frozen donors, within 6 weeks, you could theoretically be pregnant. Whereas with a fresh donor, you're really thinking 8 to 12 weeks because of all the synchronization at minimum. And that's only if everything goes perfect. I've had people pick donors who are fresh donors from an agency, and they have to wait until the person's out of school in the summer. And so they had to wait months and months and months before they could proceed ahead. Now, it's important to understand that all these donors you're going to know information about. Now, if it's not a known donor, like an anonymous donor, you're going to know things like their past history, their health, their family's health. You're going to know that they don't have any diseases, that they've been tested for genetic carrier status. So you can make sure that they don't have like cystic fibrosis status, and you have that, which could then cause your child to end up having cystic fibrosis. So all these things are reviewed. They've also been through a psychologist already, and someone has at least deemed them okay to go through as a donor. And in that situation, all you're doing at that time is just picking someone that you feel represents you best. Versus a known donor is a little bit different. With a known donor, they're not always the best donor. Meaning, if you want your sister to go through, that's fantastic. But your sister may not be a very good donor because she may not make a lot of eggs, or the quality of her eggs may not be that good. Maybe there's diseases that run in her family, or there are things, medical conditions she has. So if she was trying to be a donor for a clinic, they'd say, no way. But when it's your family member, obviously there's some priority to having it be your DNA. And so in that situation, the donor has to be evaluated by the clinic to make sure you are aware of what the chances are for that donor, because the clinic doesn't want you using your sister. You think it's great, but then it doesn't work because they know her egg quality isn't that good. So the evaluation is a little bit different now. Now the clinic is evaluating the donor, and then they're letting you know if they're a good donor or not, and let you know what your prognosis would be. Obviously, there's some ethical considerations to think about too when it's a family member or a known donor, because that person may be in your life, or that child may be around that person. The other things that comes up, the psychological portion of it. If they already have a partner and they have kids, that brings in a portion to this that could be, somewhat disruptive in their family dynamics, because it's not just her, but it's also her partner that's involved in this. They both have to be on board. I've even had patients who have identical sisters who have gone through as a donor for them. And so technically the DNA was exactly their DNA. But I think this is an important point too, to remind you that if you're using a family member, it technically is your DNA as well. I know we like to think of our DNA as like this special DNA that just came from mom and dad, that it's just us. But in reality, your DNA is your parents' DNA. And what makes you you may not even be the DNA you pass along to your kids. So if you're using a sister or brother, keep in mind that because their DNA came from the same source your DNA did, it's very possible your kid would look exactly like what your kid would look like, even when it came from you, because it all came from the same original DNA. And what makes you you isn't just the DNA you get, but which DNA ends up being dominant, and that makes you you. So if you have the fresh donor and you picked it out, the next part of the process would be the clinic and the donor getting things set up. So The donor will get a calendar and will be told when to start their medications. They usually are put on birth control first to line them up, and then they go into the stimulation. Once their eggs are retrieved, and usually for donors, a good donor is going to be somewhere between at least 12 to 16 eggs. Some can even get into 20 ranges. Eventually, once the eggs are retrieved, your partner or whoever is given a sperm will either be present that day to give the sperm earlier, or will freeze the sperm so there's no crossing of the people, because it's supposed to be anonymous. We don't want them to know you and you don't want to know them. So some places will freeze the sperm ahead of time. Others will just have you come in hours before. That way there's no way that you guys will meet. The embryos then are created. And then once the embryos are created, if the clinic is doing fresh transfers, you could theoretically do a transfer on the 5th day. If they're not, they'll freeze them. And then the following week or month later, you'll be doing the transfer. When it comes to frozen eggs, it's a little bit different. Once you have selected the donor you want, you also select how many eggs you're going to get. So for example, if you want to get 6 or 8 eggs, those are then shipped to the clinic. And then the clinic then will thaw those eggs, fertilize them with the sperm, and then that will make embryos. Fertilization with frozen eggs is always with ICSI because of the zona pellucida hardens when it gets cold through the vitrification process. And then those embryos are grown out to 5 days. And if you're not doing any testing on the embryos, you can just do a transfer on the 5th day. If you are doing testing on the embryos, then they will test the embryos, then freeze them, and then a few weeks later, you'll be doing an embryo transfer. One of the things to consider is a success rate. Now, if you're just wanting one kid, then I think frozen eggs for donors are the best, because you're only wanting 1-2 embryos. You don't want a plethora of embryos. So I think frozen eggs are great. One of the benefits of frozen eggs is you have a larger pool of donors to choose from, because these are people who have already gone through, and so these banks have large numbers of eggs to choose from. So you got a wide range. If you're wanting to build a family, then in that situation, it might be better to use a fresh donor, because you might get more embryos, and then for future kids, they will already be from that donor, and you can build your family that way. Especially for, let's say, 2 gay men, I would recommend a fresh donor if they're wanting more than one kid, because then they have that donor embryos for future children that they want, versus in the future having to get a new donor. So now they have the embryos, they can build their family. Statistically speaking, fresh donors are going to give you a slightly better chance for 2 reasons. The first is going to be you get more eggs, which means you get more embryos, which means you get more chances. The more chances you have, the better your overall success will eventually be. The second thing is when you freeze an embryo and thaw it, although the risk is very, very small of the embryo being damaged, there's still that risk that's being frozen and then thawed from the egg. And so there's that potential that may not all survive and lowers the chances a little bit. That being said, I think with today's vitrification process, you can almost consider them the same. The last part I want to get into is the cost. Using donor eggs is expensive, even more expensive than using donor sperm. Donor eggs can range as little as costing us from around $12,500 to as high as $50,000 and above. In general, frozen donor eggs for anonymous donors is usually going to be less than using a fresh donor, but there are situations when it's not true, which we'll go over. When using a frozen donor, because you're only going after maybe one pregnancy, you're getting fewer eggs. So theoretically, that donor who went through, because you're buying a portion of the eggs, you were splitting the cost of all those eggs through different families because you're getting less of them. Whereas with a fresh donor, you're getting all of the eggs. Now, why is a fresh donor more expensive? Well, one, you have to pay for the compensation of the donor. That can be between $7,000 and $15,000. Then there's the agency fee, the person who found the donor. That could be $5,000 to $10,000. Then there's the cost of putting the person through IVF, which can be between $12,000 and $20,000. Then you have legal fees, paying for the contracts, medication costs, which is about $3,000 to $5,000. There's travel costs, logistical costs, insurance costs you have to get. So it can get very expensive. Now with frozen donor eggs, you're just buying the eggs. And so by this time, it's usually between about $18,000 to $30,000, where you purchase about 6 to 8 eggs, which is somewhere between that $12,000 and $20,000 range. And then you pay for the IVF process, which is between about $6,000 and $10,000. Now, it's important to understand I'm not talking about our numbers. Our numbers are different, but we're a unique clinic. But just in general, I want you to know the overall kind of cost. So for donor eggs, the range is more like $18,000 to $30,000 versus with fresh donors around $30,000 to $50,000. Now, that's one of the benefits of using a known donor is usually your sister's not going to make you pay her money or a cousin. So the cost can be down because you're not paying for agency fee. You're not paying for donor compensation. You're just paying for the IVF and whatever legal fees are required. As a matter of fact, one of the things I tell patients to talk to their sisters about or cousins about when they approach them is they can look at it as kind of a two-for, meaning they can say, hey, if you want to freeze eggs for the future, we'll pay for that. And then all we ask is we can have like 6 or 8 eggs from you so we can potentially have a kid too. And then that way it incentivizes the person to want to do it because then they get something out of it as well, other than just, being an awesome sister. Now, the cost of the donor changes too. So like, for example, unfortunately, Asian donors and Indian donors, places charge more for because there are fewer donors going through, whereas Caucasian donors usually don't cost as much. Now, there was one donor who was Caucasian, but she was from Stanford. They wanted like $30,000 for this donor. So as you can see, it can fluctuate a lot. And someone who is successful and has had lots of pregnancies, sometimes their cost goes up as well. This is the reason a lot of patients will look to clinics to see if they have their own donors, because that can save some money. Because when you do it with a clinic, you don't have to pay an agency fee. You have a donor fee that's already determined. And so a lot of people will use what are called in-house donors, both fresh and frozen, to sometimes reduce cost. Other ways to help reduce costs is sometimes you can even use international donors. And so that can also help reduce the cost because the fees will be less than, let's say, someone in states, but it also comes with costs such as international flights and things like that. On average, I would say the average cost for using a fresh donor through a clinic, being an in-house donor, is probably going to be somewhere between that $20,000 to $30,000 if you're doing it in-house. The same thing when it comes to frozen donor eggs, probably between around $15,000 to $25,000. Versus when you use a agency, it's that $30,000 to $50,000 for fresh donor eggs, and then frozen between $18,000 and $30,000 if you're getting it from a bank. Although it's kind of patting myself on the back, one of the things at our clinic that we don't do is we don't increase the cost because someone has a different ethnicity. So whether they're Asian, Caucasian, African American, or Indian, or Hispanic, we always charge the same price. We don't think it's ethical to charge more. And again, not as a plug, but so people can know there's differences out there. For our clinic, we don't charge much more to use fresh donors. So whatever you cost for your donor, it's just a little bit more to do IVF, and you pay the normal price everyone else pays for IVF. In the same token, when we do frozen eggs, for 6 eggs at our clinic, which includes the transfer, is $12,500 currently. And for 8 eggs, which includes the transfers and the whole process, is $15,000. So as you can see, there is a large range between the different places. And so if you do have to go down this route, please do your homework because it can be very expensive some places, and it doesn't even mean you have better chances. So definitely do your homework. We're not the only place that does it affordable, but we are one of a few places that does it affordable. In the end, for whatever reason you have to use donor eggs, it's a very difficult decision. It's a very emotional decision. And it's a decision that comes with emotions that you may not even be thinking of, such as, what do I tell my kid later? This is one of the reasons why a psychologist is always involved in this, not just for the donors, but even for the recipients, because it is such an emotional decision. That being said, I think donor eggs are some of the most amazing things. For another human to help another human have a family is such an amazing thing. And I can tell you, I have never, ever met a patient who used donor eggs who said, oh, I wish they were mine. Because every single one of them looks at that kid as 100% their DNA, because it is. Because it's not just about nature. It's also about nurture. And so if you're one of those people who need to use donor eggs, don't be afraid to do it. Make sure you have a good support system around you and a good team, and move forward that and build your family. And thank you to all the people who do donate eggs to these couples. You are helping bringing life to people who want kids more than anybody. And these kids will be loved, and these people will always be grateful for you who have donated your eggs to them. As always, I hope this episode was helpful to you. Maybe you're someone who, knows a friend who's been through this, or maybe you know someone who wants to donate eggs. And this might be a great episode for them to hear. And so if you know someone, tell them about us, or even if you like this, tell me about it. I'd love to hear it. As always, I really appreciate everyone who listens to this. And as I always say, if you love us, give us a 5-star review and tell your friends and family about us. Next week, we'll be talking about donor sperm. The following week afterward, we're going to be talking about surrogacy. I really do enjoy doing these, and I really do hope it does help people. And please reach out and let me know. It just encourages me to keep doing these. As always, I look forward to talking again next week on Taco Bout Fertility Tuesday.